Welcome to the Climate Book Review. The Climate Book Review is a radio show and podcast featuring book reviews and reading lists for fiction, nonfiction, and poetry with climate themes. Climate Book Review airs every Friday at 10:30 a.m. Central on WDBX 91.1 FM, solar-powered community radio for Southern Illinois. You can also find the show online at wdbx.org, climatebookreview.com, and on your favorite podcast app or site. My name is Tree Song. I am the host of Climate Book Review. The two main segments of the show are the Climate Book of the Week and the Climate Reading List of the Week. If you have suggestions for the show, please email us at info@climatebookreview.com. Now it's time for the Climate Book of the Week. This week's Climate Book of the Week is Glass and Gardens, Solarpunk Summers. Are you looking for futuristic stories that address the climate crisis in a creative and upbeat way? Be sure to check out a short story anthology called Glass and Gardens, Solarpunk Summers. Short story anthologies are one of the best ways to read a variety of takes on a theme in a single book. This tends to make for a good reading experience across all genres and all styles of literature, but it's especially helpful in the case of climate fiction. Most but not all climate fiction strives in some way to envision a world that doesn't exist yet. If the story is set in the present day, it may explore climate catastrophes or climate solutions that are possible today but haven't actually happened yet. If the story is set in the near or far future, it may explore a world ravaged by climate consequences, far more severe than anything the world has experienced to date, or remarkable technological and social solutions that are far beyond anything that exists in the here and now. Either way, an anthology with multiple stories by multiple authors can bring a broad range of visions and styles to the task of imagining what a world changed by the climate crisis and its responses will look like. All of the stories in Glass and Gardens, Solarpunk Summers, share a few basic elements. They all take place decades or even centuries in the future. They also all envision a world in which humanity has made substantial progress, realistic or otherwise, in responding to the climate crisis. And technological advancements all play an important role in all of these stories. Beyond that, I'm tempted to say that the sky's the limit. But not all of these stories take place on Earth, so even the sky isn't the limit. The stories in this anthology have so many creative and compelling premises. The Most Dangerous Blend, for example, is a murder mystery that takes place at a weather manipulation facility in a future greatly affected by the climate crisis. This is another example of how climate fiction can often take the form of an otherwise standard tale in another genre that just happens to include some climate elements in the plot and setting. Midsummer Night's Heist features a colorful cast of characters organizing a massive, whimsical, ecologically themed guerrilla art installation in Milan under the cover of darkness. They just sneak in there while it's dark out and put up, gardens and sculptures and all sorts of fascinating stuff. Under the Northern Lights tells the tale of a DIY solar-powered airship that crash lands in a small eco-village, where a strawberry farmer takes the pilot in and helps her on her journey across the ocean. In Grow, Give, Repeat, a young child deals with the challenges and weirdness of living in a community and a society that has dealt with ecological crisis and scarcity through a combination of technological innovations, including genetic engineering. There's some really strange stuff going on there in that story with genetically engineered creatures, and a sharp focus on efficiency of food and energy systems. The child's struggles lead them to develop remarkable innovations that may have applications beyond the small homestead and town where they live. One of the weirdest stories, The Heavenly Dreams of Mechanical Trees, is the surreal tale of a mechanical forest that's designed to replace lost biological forests. It's sort of these mechanical trees with solar panels and ways of, restoring the soil and such. And it's the story of how they work and what they do and the possibility of living trees coming back. There are even 2 stories in there related to space travel, which is not usually what people think of for climate fiction, but does happen occasionally. The Spider and the Stars features a high-tech ecological society where one innovator develops new technology inspired by spiders that ultimately plays a role in humanity's reaching for the stars. It's just interesting how it has all these different new technologies that are being developed for ecological reasons, and they rely on biomimicry, learning from spiders and using that in the application of going to the stars. There's also another spacefaring one called New Siberia. In this story, all humans have become interplanetary climate refugees. The Earth has basically been destroyed by ecological crises. They don't go into too many details of what exactly happened, but living in the times we do, we can imagine. And in this story, all humans have become these refugees, and they leave Earth behind in search of a new start. And the planet they discover has aliens on it already. So there's this intercultural, interspecies relationship where they have to live on a new planet with a different species. These stories vary dramatically in terms of the tone, the style, and the degree of optimism about how the climate crisis will play out. Like I mentioned in the one, the Earth has been entirely ruined and we found another planet. In some of the other stories, there's been some crisis. They all have some degree of climate crisis. But some of the stories, there's a really peaceful, ecological, gentle society that is formed. People basically learned from their mistakes during the climate crisis and created a ecologically and socially harmonious society. So even with this variety, the one big thread tying these stories together is the exploration of solutions. They all tell stories where communities and societies have used a combination of social and technological innovations to survive the challenges of the climate crisis. And they all come out the other side with new ways of living and relating with one another. And that is one thing about the Solarpunk theme. Solarpunk is its own whole genre with a big overlap with climate fiction, where they focus on solutions and hope in the face of adversity, and the idea that together we can solve the climate crisis and work for climate justice. it's time for the climate reading list of the week. This week's climate reading list of the week is Climate Action Ahead of the Election. So this is based on a list that was provided by Yale Climate Connections. You can go to yaleclimateconnections.org. They've got a nice article there with a review of some of the stuff related to the election and this listing of books. And the descriptions are adapted from what the publishers have provided, and with a bit of my own explanation added in here as well. So they've got 12 titles that they have recommended for, as you may know, there's an election coming up that is already in progress with early voting, and Election Day is on Tuesday, coming up next week. So if you're looking for books to read that are related to it, whether it's before Election Day, during, after, here are several books that you may like. One is Glacial, The Inside Story of Climate Politics by Chelsea Henderson. That's the first Inside the Beltway account to lay bare the machinations of what went wrong in Washington, how and why our leaders failed to act on climate change, as mounting scientific evidence underscored the urgency to do so. So it's the idea is to learn from the missed opportunities. The good news today is that public opinion is at its highest level of support for climate action. So the next title they mention is Landing the Paris Climate Agreement, How It Happened, Why It Matters, and What Comes Next, by Todd Stearns. The 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change was one of the most difficult and hopeful achievements of the 21st century. 195 nations finally agreed, after 20 years of trying, to establish an ambitious operational regime to address one of the greatest civilizational challenges of our time. In Landing the Paris Climate Agreement, Todd Stearns, the chief U.S. negotiator on climate change, provides an engaging account from inside the rooms where it happened. Here's another title. The next one is Overshoot, How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown, by Wim Carton and Andreas Malm. Now, I like the fact that there is a variety in this list of these sort of more hopeful, cheery, this is what we did, it's going really well, and the more critical, this is what went wrong, these are the challenges we still face. This one is Overshoot, How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown. The world is on the cusp of 1.5 degrees of warming. But even before 1.5, climate disasters have struck with ever more devastating force. And that limit will be overshot, perhaps 2 degrees as well. How did this happen? What forces are driving us into the climate that people, particularly poor people in the global south, won't be able to cope with? They explore all of this in that book. The next title is The Heat and the Fury, On the Front Lines of Climate Violence, by Peter Schwartzstein. As a journalist on the climate security beat, he's visited ravaged Iraqi towns where ISIS used drought as a recruiting tool and weapon of terror. In Bangladesh, he interviewed farmers turned pirates who can no longer make a living off the land and instead make it off of bloody ransoms. Security forces blocked him from a dam being constructed along the Nile that has brought Egypt and Ethiopia to the brink of war. So that's why it's titled The Heat and the Fury. It's showing that climate change is often the spark that ignites long smoldering fires. That's why I've heard the term force multiplier or threat multiplier used in the case of the climate crisis. There are all of these existing crises that are happening that it is a threat multiplier for, which is a nice segue into the next title on the list, Threat Multiplier. Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security, by Sherry Goodman. Threat Multiplier takes us onto the battlefield and inside the Pentagon to show how the U.S. military is confronting the biggest security risk in global history, climate change. More than 30 years ago, when Sherry Goodman became the Pentagon's first chief environmental officer, no one would have imagined this role for the armed forces. But now the Pentagon considers climate in war games, disaster relief, international diplomacy, and even in the design of its own bases. So this is the story of how all of that came about. The next title on the list is Climate of Contempt: How to Rescue the U.S. Energy Transition from Voter Partisanship. And that's one thing I've discussed before here on this review show and on my other show, Your Community Spirit. How this has become such a partisan issue. You know, we live on the same planet and we're all affected by the climate crisis, and yet it has become so partisan. Why is the United States struggling to enact policies to reduce carbon emissions? In Climate of Contempt, David B. Spence offers a voter-centric, bottom-up explanation of national climate and energy politics, one that pinpoints bitter partisanship as the key impediment to transitioning to a net-zero carbon future. The next title on the reading list is Climate Radicals: Why Our Environmental Politics Isn't Working. This is by Cameron Abadi. In Climate Radicals, Cameron Abadi profiles the fascinating activists of the Letzte generation, known for throwing food on works of art, of Ende Gelände, which demands the immediate phase-out of coal, and the German leaders of Fridays for Future, which organizes school strikes and large-scale demonstrations. Abadi finds that the group's uncompromising stances and outrage over narrowly defined policy failures have led them to extreme acts of publicity that feed their sense of urgency. In contrast, the author argues that the American Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 represents the most significant move toward green energy in U.S. history. The next title on the list, dealing with climate and elections, is Facing the Climate Emergency: How to Transform Yourself with Climate Truth. Facing the Climate Emergency offers a cure to the climate anxiety. So this is an individually focused one. With the skill of a psychologist and the passion of an activist, the author, Margaret Klein Solomon, helps readers process fear and grief and find their place in the climate movement. So if you've been dealing with fear and grief and such over the climate crisis, this may be one. It's called Facing the Climate Emergency. The next one is called Sad Planets by Dominic Petman and Eugene Thacker. In this series of meditations, they explore some of the key negative affects, both eternal and emergent, associated with climate change. In so doing, they unearth something so obvious that it has largely gone unnoticed: the question of how we should feel about climate change. Yeah, there's a wide spectrum. There are some people who deal only with big national and international policy, and then some who zoom all the way into the personal and the feelings we're experiencing. Should we feel grief, or should we, how should we feel, how should we act, that sort of thing. Sad Planets explores this relationship between human melancholia and a more impersonal sorrow. And another title here on the list is Atlas of a Threatened Planet: 150 Infographics to Help Anyone Save the World by Esther Gunstala. Our planet is a fascinating and complex place, but the challenges we face can seem overwhelming. How does our climate actually work? Should we worry about the global supply of drinking water? How much land do we need to grow food? So in this book, they have infographics that help to answer a lot of these questions. And I love infographics. They can, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Some of these infographics can convey both the information and the urgency in a single image. Another title on the list is Into the Clear Blue Sky: The Path to Restoring Our Atmosphere by Rob Jackson. Climate scientist and chair of the Global Carbon Project, Rob Jackson thinks we need to redefine our goals. He says that we shouldn't only be trying to stabilize the Earth's temperature at some arbitrary value, we should aim to restore the atmosphere. Restoring the atmosphere means reducing the amount of greenhouse gases in the air to pre-industrial levels. That's quite the goal. And this is one I've heard a lot of buzz about in a good way. What if we get it right? Visions of Climate Futures by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do while facing an existential crisis is imagine life on the other side. This provocative and joyous book maps an inspiring landscape of possible climate futures. Through clear-eyed essays and vibrant conversations infused with data, poetry, and art, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson guides us through solutions and possibilities as the nexus of science, policy, culture, and justice. Visionary farmers and financiers, architects and advocates help us to conjure a flourishing future, one worth the effort it will take, from all of us with whatever we have to offer, to create. If you haven't yet been able to picture a transformed and replenished world, or to see yourself, your loved ones, and your community in that world, this book is for you. And once again, the title of that one is What If We Get It Right? Visions of Climate Futures by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. That's actually the next nonfiction title I would like to review once I get my hands on it. I may do another fiction title or two first, but I do want to review that one here on the air. If you have any other titles you'd like us to review on the air, you can email them to me, info@climatebookreview.com. Thank you for listening to the Climate Book Review. You can find more information about this episode and show at climatebookreview.com. If you have suggestions for the show, please email us at info@climatebookreview.com. If you enjoyed this episode, you can support the show by telling your friends, giving the show a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast apps, and of course, donating to WDBX. You can visit wdbx.org. You, the listeners, are the ones who keep us on the air. Thank you to WDBX for broadcasting this and many other good shows. Thank you to Liborio Conti for the music. And thank you to Ed Hawkins for the Warming Stripes graphic that we use in our logo. You can learn more about that at showyourstripes.info. It's a wonderful artistic way of demonstrating the effects of the climate crisis. So finally, thank you to everyone who is reading, writing, and taking action in response to the climate crisis. With our powers combined, we can make climate justice a reality.